My grandmother told me the same thing every autumn since I was 7 years old. Never move the scarecrow after dark, Charlotte. Not for any reason. I laughed about it for 26 years. I stopped laughing the night I found it standing 11 feet from where I'd nailed it down myself, facing the house. My name is Charlotte Dunmore, and this farm has belonged to my family since 1952. When my grandmother Evelyn bought 60 acres of Nebraska farmland with money nobody ever explained where it came from. She's been gone 3 years now, and I inherited more than land when she passed. I inherited a rule I never understood, and a silence she kept for 6 decades. Before I tell you what happened this past October, I need you to do 2 things. Hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel grow. And I want more people to hear this story exactly as it happened. And subscribe, because what's coming in the next few weeks on this channel, you're not going to want to miss. Now, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. What city, what country? I read every single one, and I promise you, knowing people from all over the world are sitting with me through this makes it easier to tell. I grew up spending every summer on this farm, and every autumn my grandmother would walk me out to the north field where the scarecrow stood. The same scarecrow, rebuilt piece by piece over the decades, but never fully replaced, like she was afraid of what would happen if every original part disappeared at once. She'd point at it and give me the same warning, word for word, every single year. Never move him after dark. Not for any reason, Charlotte. Not even if you think he needs it. I always assumed it was superstition. Farm folklore, the kind every rural family collects like heirlooms. Nobody quite believes in, but nobody throws away either. My grandmother wasn't an anxious woman. She was sharp, practical, the type who fixed her own tractor engine and didn't tolerate nonsense. Which is exactly why, when I moved back to run the farm full-time after she passed, that one irrational rule stuck with me more than anything else she ever said. I didn't think about it much until the leaves started turning this year. Until the morning I walked out to check the field and found the scarecrow's post standing empty and the scarecrow itself lying in the dirt 40 feet away, arms spread, facing the farmhouse like it had been trying to crawl toward it. That was the first morning. It was not the last. The ground around the scarecrow's post told a story I didn't want to read. I crouched down in the cold mud, coffee still steaming in my other hand, and studied the marks circling where the post should have stood upright. They weren't footprints. Not boots, not bare feet, not any hoof or paw I recognized from 8 years of running livestock. They were long, dragging grooves, spaced too evenly to be random, curving inward like something had circled the post before, pulling it clean out of ground that had held it steady through 6 Nebraska winters. I told myself it was wind damage. A storm nobody predicted, maybe a coyote that got tangled in the burlap and thrashed until the post gave. I've built enough fences and dug enough post holes to know how deep that thing was set. 2 feet minimum, packed with gravel at the base the way my grandmother always insisted. Wind doesn't pull something like that. Not cleanly. Not without snapping the wood. But the post wasn't snapped. It was lying beside the fallen scarecrow, whole, like someone had lifted it out and set it down with care. I walked the 40 feet between the post and where the scarecrow now lay. And that's when I noticed something that made my stomach fold in on itself. The burlap face, the one my grandmother sewed by hand, patched a dozen times over 60 years, had been turned to face the farmhouse. Not fallen that way. Positioned. The straw-stuffed arms were spread wide across the dirt, fingers of woven wire reaching toward the porch like something interrupted mid-crawl. I stood there longer than I should have, coffee going cold, before I made the decision that I now understand was the first real mistake I made in this whole story. I told myself Evelyn wasn't here to enforce her own rule anymore, and rules made by dead women who never explain themselves don't carry the same weight in daylight. So I picked the scarecrow up myself, hauled the post back to its hole, packed the dirt tight around the base with my own 2 hands, and set him upright again, facing the field the way he was supposed to. It was barely past 10 in the morning, broad daylight, blue sky. Nothing about the moment felt like the kind of thing you'd regret. I finished the job, dusted off my jeans, and walked back to the house without looking behind me even once. I should have looked, because by the time I stepped onto the porch, something in the kitchen window was already watching me do it. I turned around before my hand even touched the porch railing. Some part of my body knew before my mind caught up. The kind of instinct that comes from being watched. The skin-prickling certainty you get standing in an empty room that isn't actually empty. The kitchen window faced the north field, faced the exact spot where I just reburied that post with my own hands, and for half a second, I saw something behind the glass that didn't belong there. A shape, upright, still, not moving, just present. I told myself it was a reflection. Cloud shifting, maybe my own shadow, thrown back at me by the angle of the morning sun. But I know my own kitchen, and I know what my silhouette looks like against that window. And this was taller than me, wider through the shoulders, standing in a spot no living person could stand. Because that spot is where the counter sits, where the cabinets rise up to the ceiling with no floor space behind them at all. I crossed the yard faster than I meant to. My boots hit the porch steps, the screen door, the kitchen tile, and the room was empty. Of course it was empty. I stood there, breathing hard in a kitchen that hadn't changed since I was a kid, willing my heartbeat to slow down, telling myself the story I always tell myself when the farm gets too quiet and my imagination gets too loud. But the window told a different story. There, on the inside of the glass, low near the sill, was a smear of condensation shaped wrong for any explanation I could construct. Not a full handprint, not quite fingers. More like something had pressed itself flat against the glass from the inside, holding still long enough to fog it, then pulled away before I made it through the door. I touched it. It was cold. Colder than the room around it had any right to be, like the chill had come from something that didn't carry body heat the way people do. I checked every room in that house before I let myself sit down. Closets, the cellar, the space beneath my grandmother's old bed that I hadn't looked under since I was young enough to be scared of the dark for ordinary reasons. Nothing. No sign that another living soul had been inside since I left that morning. And the doors were locked exactly the way I'd left them, dead bolted from the inside. Which meant whatever had stood at that window either never needed a door in the first place, or knew this house better than any stranger should. I sat at the kitchen table until the light started fading, staring at that window, and made a decision I'd never admit to anyone who didn't already believe stranger things than I used to. I went to the hall closet, pulled out the box of my grandmother's belongings I'd never had the courage to go through, and started looking for anything. A letter, a photograph, a diary. That might explain what Evelyn Dunmore had spent 60 years trying not to say out loud. I found her old journal near the bottom, its leather cover cracked with age, and the moment I opened it to a random page, one line stopped my hand cold. He only comes to the window when someone's moved him. He's checking to see who did it. I didn't sleep that night. I made sure of it. I brewed a full pot of coffee, dragged the armchair from the living room over to the window that faced the north field, and sat there with my grandmother's journal closed on my lap, unread past that single line, because some part of me wanted to witness this before I let anything else color what I was about to see. The farm gets a particular kind of quiet after midnight that people who don't live rural never quite understand. It's not silence. It's the absence of human sound layered over 100 small ones. Wind through dead corn stalks. An owl somewhere past the tree line. The occasional groan of the old barn settling on its foundation, the way it's done every night for 70 years. I know these sounds the way I know my own heartbeat, which is exactly why the new sound the one that started around 2 a.m., made every hair on my arms stand up before my conscious mind even identified what was wrong with it. It was a dragging sound, slow, rhythmic, coming from the direction of the field. The unmistakable drag of something heavy being pulled across dry earth. Pause, drag again, like footsteps that didn't lift so much as slide. I pressed my face to the cold glass and watched the tree line at the edge of my vision, watching for the post, for the Scarecrow silhouette against the horizon where the moon gave just enough light to make shapes out of darkness. The post was still standing. I could see that much clearly, but something was moving near its base, low to the ground, circling it the same way those grooves in the dirt had circled it that morning. Except this time, I was watching it happen in real time, and the shape doing the circling didn't move like anything I'd ever seen walk on two legs or four. It moved wrong. Joints bending in places joints don't bend, low to the soil like it was mapping the post position by touch rather than sight, and every few seconds it paused entirely still. The way prey freezes, except this thing wasn't prey. It was doing the hunting. Then, without warning, it straightened. Fully upright, taller than the post itself, and turned toward the house. I don't remember deciding to move, but I found myself backed against the far wall of the living room, journal clutched to my chest, watching the window I'd just been sitting at like it might shatter at any second. The dragging sound started again, closer now, unmistakably closer, moving from the field toward the yard, toward the house, toward the exact window where that same fogged handprint from the morning was still faintly visible on the glass. It stopped directly outside. I could hear it breathing, or something that approximated breathing, wet and uneven, pressed right up against the wall, separating us. And I realized in that frozen, silent moment that whatever this thing was, it wasn't checking on the Scarecrow anymore. It was checking on me. Every instinct I had told me to run for the bedroom, lock the door, wait for sunrise like a coward with no other choice. But something else moved through me in that moment, something closer to my grandmother's stubbornness than my own fear. And I found myself walking back toward that window instead of away from it. If this thing had been circling my family's land for 60 years, watching, waiting, testing whoever disturbed its post, then I decided I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life flinching every time the wind changed direction. I wanted to see it all the way. No glass fogged with breath standing between us as an excuse to look away. I reached the window and did not let myself hesitate. I looked straight into it. What stood on the other side of that glass wasn't a man, and it wasn't quite the Scarecrow either, though it wore pieces of both like an ill-fitting coat stitched together across decades. The face was burlap, my grandmother's burlap, patched a dozen times over, but stretched taut over something that had a jaw, that had the architecture of cheekbones beneath it, moving the fabric the way skin moves beneath a mask. The eyes weren't stitched buttons anymore. They were dark, wet, entirely too aware, and they were fixed on me with a focus that had nothing animal and nothing kind in it. It didn't blink. It didn't need to. For 3 full seconds, neither of us moved. I stood with my palm flat against the cold glass, mirroring without meaning to the exact position of that handprint from the morning, and I understood with a certainty that settled somewhere below language that this creature had done this before. Stood at this window, waited for someone to notice it noticing them. Then it tilted its head, slow, deliberate, the burlap creasing at an angle no human neck could manage, and it lifted one arm, wire fingers, straw knuckles, and pressed it flat against the glass across from my hand. Close enough that if the window hadn't been there, we would have been touching. I saw something in its face shift. Not aggression, recognition. And in that instant, staring at a creature wearing my family's oldest secret like a second skin, I thought of the line from Evelyn's journal. He's checking to see who did it. And understood, all at once, that this wasn't punishment for moving the post. This was a ritual my grandmother had performed correctly for 60 consecutive years, and I had broken it that very morning without knowing the rules. It opened its mouth. No sound came out at first, just the impression of a voice trying to remember how shaping words used to work. Decades of disuse cracking through wherever this thing had learned language in the first place. And then, barely audible through the glass, distorted and wrong, but unmistakably formed, it said a name, not mine. Evelyn. It thought I was my grandmother. And the way its wire hand pressed harder against the glass when it said that name told me exactly how badly it wanted her back. I didn't sleep after it spoke that name. I sat with Evelyn's journal until the sky started turning gray, reading everything I'd avoided reading for 3 years, and by the time the sun came up, I understood exactly what my grandmother had carried alone since she was 23 years old. In 1952, before this was farmland, before any Dunmore ever set foot on these 60 acres, the property belonged to a man named Josiah Kettering. According to the journal, my grandmother didn't buy this land with mysterious savings. She bought it from Josiah's widow for almost nothing, because nobody else in the county would touch it. Josiah had a younger brother, Isaiah, who worked this same field for years, quiet and troubled, a man the town whispered about more than they ever spoke to directly. The details Evelyn wrote were sparse, clearly things she'd pieced together secondhand, but the shape of it was clear enough. Isaiah disappeared one October, and the family told anyone who asked that he'd simply left for work out west. Evelyn didn't believe that story even as a young woman, and she believed it less with every year she spent on this land afterward. Because the Scarecrow standing in that field, the one that predates my grandmother's ownership entirely, was built by Isaiah himself from his own clothes in the final weeks before he vanished. And whatever happened to him that October, the journal suggests, in words Evelyn clearly struggled to commit to paper, that he never actually left the property at all. My grandmother didn't discover this by research. She discovered it the way I did, by staying up one night decades ago, watching, and eventually being brave enough to look through the glass instead of away from it. She wrote that Isaiah's spirit, or whatever remained of him bound to that field and that burlap shell, had one need above all others: to be acknowledged, not feared, not exercised, simply seen by whoever tended the land he died on, once a year on the anniversary of his disappearance, which fell, I checked the date against the journal 3 times to be sure, on the exact night I'd found the Scarecrow move from its post. Evelyn's ritual wasn't complicated. She walked out every October on that one specific night, and she spoke to him, told him his name, told him he was remembered, told him the land was still being cared for by someone who knew he existed. That was all it ever took to settle him until the following year. I understood then that I hadn't broken some ancient curse by fixing the Scarecrow in daylight. I'd simply never done the one thing that mattered, because nobody ever told me it existed to be done at all. So that same evening, alone in the cold, I walked out to the field, stood in front of that patched burlap face, and said the only thing I could think to say. Isaiah, I know your name. I know what happened to you. And I'm sorry nobody said it sooner. You're not forgotten. Not by this family, not on this land. The wire hand at its side loosened. The wrongness in its joints seemed to settle into something closer to stillness, closer to rest. And for the first time since I'd found that Scarecrow lying in the dirt, I felt no fear standing in front of it at all. Only the strange, aching grief of a promise inherited 60 years too late. I still walk out to that field every October now on the same night, and I say his name out loud. I don't know if it's superstition or something realer than that. And after everything I witnessed, I've stopped needing an answer either way. What I do know is that my grandmother spent 60 years quietly carrying the weight of a stranger's forgotten death, and she never once complained about the burden of remembering him. Some legends aren't warnings. Some of them are just grief, waiting for someone patient enough to listen. If this story moved you even a little, do me a favor and hit that like button. It costs you nothing, and it means everything for a channel like this one trying to grow. And if you haven't yet, subscribe, because there are more stories like Charlotte's Coming, stories about the things families inherit along with the land itself. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if you've ever heard a family legend that turned out to be more literal than anyone expected,